Welcome and good afternoon, dear friends. We are having a very special program today, and on behalf of the Vivekananda Vedanta Society of Chicago, I'm really honored today to welcome Fr Larry Dowling as our guest speaker. Fr Larry Dowling, ordained in 1991, has served a pastor of St. Denis Parish and as associate pastor at St. James in Arlington Heights, Illinois, and subsequently for 18 years as pastor of St. Simon of Syren Parish, from where he retired last year. Fr Larry has a passion for healing and restoration of the spirit, mind, and body of those who have suffered trauma from the multiple ongoing manifestations of systemic racism. He helped establish the Encompassing Center, a free mental health center for the Chicago West Side community. He is a trained restorative justice practitioner and has served on the advisory boards of multiple organizations as well as on the steering committee that created the first restorative justice community court in Cook County. Fr Larry holds a Master's of Divinity and a Doctor of Ministry degrees and is the former president of the board for Arise Chicago, an interfaith labor rights organization. Today at the Home of Harmony, Fr Larry will be speaking on the topic, Faith as the Only Path to Racial Healing and Repair. There will be time for question and answer after the talk, so hold your questions and have them ready. And on that note, please join me in welcoming Fr Larry to begin his talk.
Good afternoon to everyone. It is an incredible privilege to be here with all of you. Anytime I can come together in a holy place, I feel that energy. The energy comes from the place itself, but it comes from the spirit of those who are present and the spirit of all those who have, worshiped in this space, come together in this space, listened in this space, dialogue in this space, all of those things that have been, that are so important to who we are as human beings. We are people of relationship. None of us, as our society wants to, tell us at times, none of us are self-made men or self-made women. We are created, first of all, out of love, out of relationship, and in that relationship is this life-giving energy that God gives us, that strengthens us, that fortifies us, and that we need to continue to tap into in all the ways that we live our lives. That energy that is at the very heart of who we are, and that really connects us all as one. The sense that there is one truth. The truth is in God. And for me, God is love, God is truth, God is beauty, because all of those things, take us out of ourselves to seek something greater, to see something deeper, to engage in, meaningful ways, so that we might be life-giving to each other. But early on in our lives, I love this story, and I'm going to share this story that was shared with me a number of years ago. There was a couple that had a 4-year-old son, and they also had a 3-month-old daughter, infant daughter. And the son went to them one day, to the couple, and said, I want to talk to my sister. And they said, okay. And they said, I want to talk to her alone. And so, they took him into the room, and they took him over by the crib, and they walked out the door. They closed the door, but of course they didn't close it all the way. They listened. And what they heard their son say to the little daughter is, "Where do you come from? Who made you? I'm beginning to forget." Where do you come from? Who made you? I'm beginning to forget. And for me, the heart of that story is really, we all come from this, incredible Spirit of God that, that gives each and every one of us, this great gift of life. This life that we live, this life that, hopefully we live true to who God made us to be. To not only God created us in love, but God created each and every one of us for a purpose. And God ultimately calls us in this life to continue to help each other to grow and to build this unity in love. Over the years, though, we can forget where we come from. And so I always emphasize to parents and grandparents to remind their children and grandchildren every day, where do they come from? Where do they come from? And I try to do that with my own, the people that I have the privilege to work with, the people I minister to, the people I minister with, people who sometimes minister to me. But to engage that spirit and remind each other of where we come from, who made us, because we do forget. I grew up in Paris. Anybody surprised by that? But I have to qualify it. Paris, Illinois. Paris, Illinois is a small town in central Illinois, right on the border of Indiana, right across from, if anybody knows Terre Haute, Indiana, that's where I grew up. I'm originally from downstate. My great-great-great-grandfather was one of the founders of Effingham, Illinois. My father's family is from Mattoon, Illinois, so all central Illinois. My great-great-great-grandfather was a stowaway from Germany, so I guess you might call that an undocumented, illegal, whatever. And then on my father's side, the family came over during the Irish potato famine. I also have the, pleasure of knowing that on my dad's side, we were actually related to Abraham Lincoln. So it's nice to have that heritage, and as I think I read 14, 15 books about Abraham Lincoln and his life, and he was not a perfect person. He was involved in, emancipation and freeing the slaves, but he was, not a perfect person because he still believed in the midst of that. And the reason that he did it was not for the reason of actually freeing people, but it was his way to save the nation, he thought. Ultimately, when that freedom happened, Lincoln himself, would say that he still felt that black people were still inferior to white people. And so, again, not a perfect person, did a great thing, in this freedom that should have happened in the beginning of our country. But ultimately, again, it's this path toward continued knowing, continuing to discover the truth, continuing to uncover, this sense of where we come from and what do we believe? What are the stories we tell? What are the stories we don't tell? What are the silences that are ashamed to speak the truth? And what are the silences that preserve that, continued racism that, is in our society? I had a conversation a few years ago with the head of the Chicago Theological Seminary, and the first black president, and it's Dr. Stephen Ray. And in talking to Dr. Ray, I asked him the question, how would you describe racism in relation to, in the Christian tradition, what we call the body of Christ, which is really everyone, all of us together in the midst of this. And he said, it is like a cancer. in the body of Christ. It's like a cancer in us. And he said it won't destroy us, but it makes us less than what we could be if we truly dealt with it. We truly come to understand it. If we truly kind of, come to terms with this thing that we carry within us. For 18 years, as was mentioned, I was pastor at an African-American Catholic church in North Lawndale, West Side, one of the toughest communities in the city. But wonderful people, family people. Very harsh living situations at times. A community devastated by first housing abuses from the contract buying in the 50s and 60s, where black families were not given the same, deal, if you will, in buying a home, that they had to sign a contract with realtors. It would be like 30 years. They would pay their monthly, bills. But if they missed one bill along the way, even in the final years, if they missed one payment, the house could be taken away from them. And they would lose every part of the equity in that community. So over the course of 5 or 6 years, the community in Chicago affected by this lost over $5 billion in equity that would have been passed on to the younger generation. $5 billion in equity lost. Oftentimes, the payments were 20 to 30% higher than they would be in a place like Skokie. There was this incredible abuse that happened. And so that was really, part of the start of the deterioration of that community. And then in the 60s, and Dr. King, again, more devastation. And after Dr. King and the riots, there was this introduction of drugs and guns into the community. And literally, it was, an intentional introduction of drugs and guns into the community by the powers that be. There was this intentional making sure that drugs got into the community so that people would, especially the black community, would get addicted, guns to make sure that there was violence and crime. And in the midst of it all, eventually, they passed this, what was called the war on drugs. The testimony that I've heard from a number of the people that I work with in North Lawndale is that there literally, during that time that drugs and guns were being introduced in the community, there were literally police escorts of trucks with guns and drugs into the community. And so again, intentional. And then when the so-called war on drugs happened in the 70s and 80s, supported by both Democrats and Republicans, there was, again, now you're going to be prosecuted. If you are doing drugs, if you're selling drugs, you are going to be prosecuted if you own a gun, or if you have a gun and it's not registered. And so, because the federal government was funding communities to be able to, search for people that fit those descriptions, and there was a need, especially in black communities where police were underfunded, it was a way for police to get funding and give them an incentive. And so the incentive was to arrest anyone along the way. And so, again, North Lawndale is indicative. Over 60% of the community in North Lawndale has been justice involved. And predominantly, those are drug convictions or drug arrests. I work with many men and women who were formerly incarcerated, great people, family people, but caught up in a system that was focused on imprisonment of them. And again, the effect, obviously, affecting families, separation of families, really what I would consider the breakdown of the black family. And then this whole sense of creating a really a subclass in the United States of black men who have been incarcerated, who when they get out are not given a lot of opportunity for housing, for jobs, and for things. Some of that's changing, thankfully, but that has been the pattern. And so working within the community and working with the community for me has been about, okay, how do we recognize that? How do I, as a white person, come in, not as a savior, but trying to get to know people? How do I connect with them? How do I understand what they need? And how together do we lift each other up? Oftentimes we will say, well, it's important that we empower each other. Has anybody ever said that? We need to empower other people, especially the poor. Has anybody here ever said that? We need to empower others. So we need to lift them up, okay? I do not use that language anymore by itself. I use the term mutual empowerment, because from my faith, I believe that if I have something to offer another person and they accept it, I'm offering them a gift, but they're offering me a gift by accepting it. It's what I'm supposed to be doing as a Christian, as a fellow human being. So sometimes I mirror this, and I'll go out, and change us. Because if we are acting out of our faith traditions, okay, and we are offering others something, they are giving back to us by accepting those gifts. And so we lift each other up. And so it's, for sometimes I think, it's a challenge, especially to people who have a lot of money and, just given, it's a tax deduction or they get their name on a building or something like that. But I think to really ask the question of where does that come from? Where does your giving come from? Does it come from the commitment of faith that God has gifted us with these gifts that we have the ability to share with others? That it's really not a choice, but it's a requirement to help others. Because not only do we help them, but they help us in living out our faith. It is that connection, that lifting each other up, that more and more I'm just trying to, preach to people, is because we get in this kind of like, okay, I'm going to help this person. And this is unfortunately, this is true in the Catholic Church and, in other faith traditions, is that we sometimes look at the black community or the Hispanic community as this community that needs our help, what I call as deficit communities. Okay, we need to help these poor people. They need our help. And in turn, we say, and really they don't have anything to offer us. And we need to change that mentality. Because in my experience in the black community, I have learned a lot. I have been touched a lot by black spirituality. I've been touched deeply by that spirituality so much that, 4 years ago now, I decided that I was wanting to write a book about my experience in the black community and the change that it made in me as a white person and the invitation to other people who look like me to come to terms with that racism that we all hold within us. And it's not to call anyone racist, okay? It's simply to say this is something that has been built into us over 400 years. Over 400 years. We're not to blame for this. It is something that is embedded in us. After 18 years in the black community, people would often say, Father, you don't have a racist bone in your body. And I would say, gosh, I wish that were true. I wish that were true. But there's always that thing that hangs with me that, thankfully, because I've built relationships within the Black community and other communities, like this wonderful community here, that all of those prejudices break down. I can, when those things arise, I can just push them away and say, no, that's just not true. That's just not true. But I needed to learn that. See, where I grew up was an all-white community, Paris, Illinois. All-white community. If a Black person moved in the community, they were there very long. My parents taught us to treat others, as individuals, the content of their character. They were very good about preaching that to us. Not always living that out, because occasionally they would see, Black people or people of color on TV and, and make comments and things like that, And so it wasn't always a kind of like, this is, there was some lack of clarity in what they said and what they did. And what I have to say is, for over 25 years, I never had the opportunity, because of that segregated, situation, to ever really get to know a Black person, to really get to know, their struggles, their dreams, their hopes, to really kind of understand, what the challenges were. And again, for me, our society is kind of built on that structure of continued segregation. People in power want us to keep us at this level of, fighting with each other, when our faith tells us, no, that's not where it's at. It's in this relationship with each other. It's getting to know each other. It's trying to understand, our struggles, our pains, but also our hopes and dreams. To listen to each other's experience. In many ways, Pope Francis for me was one of my heroes, because he's called the Pope of Mercy. Mercy, again, I think in every tradition, has a different meaning or a different description or whatever. That I'd be interested to hear, in the tradition, of others what that means. But for me, the way I can best interpret it is that we need to get under each other's skin, but in a good way. But in a good way. Which means when I encounter someone, what's the first thing we ask someone when we meet them? What's typically the question we ask people when we first meet someone? It's typically, what do you do? What do you do for a living? Okay, we don't ask them, like a good friend of mine taught me, and I'm learning more and more to do. We don't say, it's good to know you. And to ask a question like, tell me what you want me to know about you. Tell me what you want me to know about you. And interestingly enough, when I've done that, people are like, really? You want to know about me? And as they share, and as I share, they will share far more deeply than this surface conversation that often happens. It's this importance of just being open to those conversations, and especially across racial lines. Because again, our society is set up so that we can't get together, so that there's this obstacle in us that keeps us apart. And again, in us as white people, and in Black people as well, there's this kind of there's this distancing that is somehow built within us. And a lot of that has to do with history of racism, prejudice, all these sorts of things. But it's there, and we need to recognize it. There's a book called The Hidden Wound, and the author's name is going out of my head right now. But in this book, he's a white man, and he's a nature writer. And so he wrote this book to talk about, it was the only book he ever wrote. He wrote about 50 books, all about nature. But he decided to write a book called The Hidden Wound that where he talked about his history of growing up in a home, on a farm, where they had black servants, not slaves, but they had black servants. And they had a woman in the house, a black woman in the house who was the cook and housekeeper and all that, and a black man who was helping his father work the farm and all those sorts of things. And he talked about this relationship that he had with them, but not really getting to know them, not really getting to know, again, the challenges that they had. Getting to know them out of their love for him and his love for them, but never sitting and listening to their stories. And he wrote this book because it's like, somehow I need to fill that in, that history, what I'm missing here. And if we look at the history of our nation, people, we can talk about the history and what the nation, how the nation began, and we know it was a fight for freedom from Britain and from, this British system. But ultimately, and again, this is some of the history that is buried, that a lot of people don't know about, is that the country, the Revolutionary War would not have happened if not for racism, if not for slavery. And here's why. The North was very focused on kind of like this separation from Britain, the taxation without representation. We've heard all those stories. I don't hear much about what the South was doing at that time, but the South was still actively trading with Britain and really didn't care because they were making a lot of money. But there was this case in England where a man had taken his enslaved, this slave that he owned, and somehow someone talked to the slave and said, you should go to court here in England and say, that doesn't hold up here. I shouldn't have to be a slave to this man in England. And it went to court, and the man won, and he won his freedom. That case got a lot of headlines, and the South began to fear that England was going to pass laws to ban slavery. And so they panicked. That is when they joined the North in the Revolutionary War. So again, all of this is connected, and we fail to see that. We have this, image that has been created that, our intent was pure, that, we founded this nation for, freedom, for religious freedom, and all of these sorts of things. But underlying all of it was, we got to preserve slavery. We got to preserve this because it's a free workforce, and it's making us a lot of money, not just in the South, but in the North. Again, that's the myth that we continue to cling to. What this author, and I will remember his name eventually, my apologies, suggested in his book is that, and the image, something that just sits with me, because he said, within every white person is the hollow image of a black person, is the hollow image of a black person. And he said, as white people, we are taught to be nice to black people, to be nice to them, to, treat them with respect. But we never take the time to fill in that empty space within us, to get to know their stories, to understand their struggles, and for them to understand ours as well. Our society is built up to segregate us. That segregation occurred for me in the town I grew up in. It was an all-white community. No black person really allowed to move into the community. But that can happen, we know, in Chicago, in segregated communities. We know it happens all the time in different places. And we know that the people in power thrive on power in keeping us separated. And so there's this intentional thing that we need to do that is difficult because we don't have those connections. How do you make those connections? And so as I've talked to other, especially my white brothers and sisters about this, You say, yeah, you're right. We need to find ways to do that. But where do we begin? How do we invite? How do we reach out? Who do we reach out to? Because we're not connected to any black people, and they're not connected to us. And so how do we do that? And I think that's the ongoing question for all of us, is how do we bridge those places and create spaces where we can come together and share, get to know each other. And not to talk about racism right away, or, but to just get to know each other, to build relationships, just to get to know each other as, as fellow human beings, as children of God. But along the way, to then, as we start telling our stories, to hear those stories of the struggles, of the pains, of that history. But also for us as white people to be able to kind of like say, okay, yeah, I carry this wound as well. It's a 400-year wound that I carry that I need to acknowledge, because I don't want to carry it, because I know what it does is it allows me to stay in this place where I can say, oh yeah, racism is wrong and all this kind of stuff, but am I actively doing anything about it? Am I really taking risks for love, as I sometimes use the term, to reach out and to engage others who do not look like me, to try to build relationships with others? And those are the spaces somehow we as people of faith, across every faith tradition, I think need to think about. How do we create those spaces where people come together and we can have, first of all, just build some basic relationships with each other. It's the heart of mercy. It's like, we got to get to know each other. And then we can have those hard conversations. Then we can get at it. And, along the way, I've had the privilege of, inviting people I know from different churches to come together, from different racial backgrounds, particularly for that purpose. We always spend the first 3 or 4 gatherings just getting to know each other. And then we start talking about race. And then we start talking about some of the other challenges in society that that people face. And there's a bond that's built, and there's knowledge that we gain, wisdom that we gain. And it builds an energy to say, okay, who else do we need to invite? What more can we do? How can we make a difference? So I am in the process, inspired by this book, The Hidden Wound, and inspired by the work of James Cone, who is an African theologian, wrote a book about 40 years ago now, he wrote several books on African Christian theology and liberation theology. But he wrote a book that is a book that I continue to kind of hold up as something that I'm focused out of as I'm writing my own book. He wrote a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And he compared the cross of Jesus to the lynching tree. The lynching tree that was was the sign of horror and terror for black people throughout the history post emancipation. The over 4,500 lynchings that happened along the way. Over 3,200 of those 4,500 lynchings that were public lynchings, where men and women and children would come together to celebrate and watch the lynching, where they would have picnics, where they would, after someone was lynched, burn the bodies. If I get too graphic here, excuse me, but they would take the bones as souvenirs. They would take pictures with the lynched person's body. They would sell postcards, send postcards to their friends and family members. 3,200 out of 4,700 lynchings, public, children present, men and women, partying, children being let out of school to go to these events. That history is deep, and that history is a history of terror and horror for the black community. Lynching continues to happen today, not necessarily with ropes, but by stepping on the necks of people and watching them die. that continues to happen. So again, the challenge for us, I think, as people of faith is what do we do? How do we, first of all, name the wound that we carry? And then what do we do about that? How do we, how do we recognize that? Sometimes a question I ask, especially white, audiences that I have, the ability to speak to, congregations that, one of the questions I ask because, when they ask me to talk about racism, there's always kind of, I think, this sense of, okay, we're enlightened people, we just want you to come and talk about it, and, not really ask us to do anything, but we just want you to come and talk about it. And so one of the questions I ask, in those spaces is, okay, would you as a white person want to be treated as black people are today? Would you as a white person want to be treated as black people are today? Because we oftentimes hear, and this is some of my own family from downstate, they have all the opportunities that everybody else has. They're treated, they're just not trying hard enough, or they're not working hard enough, or those sorts of things. But then I ask the question, would you want to be treated the same as black people are treated today? Never have I heard anyone say, I would be okay with that. Because we know deep down, we know. As much as we want to deny it, we know. So how do we acknowledge that? How do we then acknowledge that and say, okay, what can I learn? What are the things I need to learn to change, to be a better person? To come to terms with this and acknowledge this wound that I carry, that again, I didn't cause the wound. This is something that was passed on generation over generation over generation of 400 years of this embedded, stereotypes into our psyche, into our subconscious. That whenever, conversation of race comes up, we immediately get defensive, within all of us, every thought, this is a bit of anatomy and physiology and all that, but every thought that goes into our mind goes first through what they call the lizard brain, okay? And the lizard brain is what determines, okay, is this a threat? If I feel it's a threat, I either need to fight or flee or just try to rationalize and walk away, get away from the situation. That's in all of us. And so within us as white people, and it happens in others as well, because we're all subject to this racism that is, again, in our society. And again, I'm not trying to shame people or guilt people or anything. It's just to acknowledge that we carry this wound. And so, so what do we do with that? How do we come to terms with that and say, okay, how do I break that down? So when that comes at me, I can immediately say, okay, that's my lizard brain saying, don't enter into this, okay? And the common things are, okay, I'm not racist, I've got black friends, or, I'm not racist, and we do this kind of bargaining, or like we're in a courtroom where it's like we're trying to make a case against something, and believe me, I've heard it over and over again, especially from relatives, most of my relatives still live downstate, and it's still a struggle for me because, as I talk about this stuff, it's like, I get the pushback. I mean, my sister, it's been a while back, she brought up the conversation actually, and and she, and again, she just felt the need to blurt out, I'm not racist, I've got black friends. So I decided, okay, tell me about your black friends. And she said, well, we socialize at church, and we volunteer together, spaghetti dinner that we have every few months, and all this kind of stuff. And I said, so what do you know about them and their lives? And since you brought up race, how race, being black, has affected their lives. And her first response was interesting because she said, why would I need to know that? And said, well, friends know each other. They know some of the deep things about each other. So we're not talking about friends here. We're talking about black acquaintances, people you get along with. You know, if they were truly friends, they would know, you would know their history, and they would know your history. They would know the things you've been through. You would know the things they've been through. And it made her think, I don't know whether she's done anything about it, but it made her think, and she doesn't do that, pushback. I still get the occasional, well, you know, black people own slaves as well, you know, or, you know, well, African people, you know, turn their own people, you know, into becoming slaves and all that kind of stuff. Again, all that history, you know, it's like we're trying to make a case for not having to deal with, you know, and so again, for me, the only way to get at this stuff is through faith and through, you know, this. How do we connect at the level that we're all children of God, that we're all created, you know, and that no one is inferior or superior to another person, as is so much ingrained within, you know, within a lot of us. We won't admit it, we won't, you know, but we get in, you know, all this different, I think, what I call spiritual gymnastics to try to rationalize, you know, this within ourselves. But it's like, how do we break that down? How do we acknowledge that and the wound that we carry? The two parishes that were mentioned that I pastored, both St. Denis and St. Agatha, you know, St. Simon of Cyrene now, are parishes that had priests who were actively abusing children before I got there. And so, you know, I was asked to go in to be, you know, to help with the healing process, you know, which, you know, and so I've learned a lot about this stuff, a lot about abuse. And, you know, something I never studied in seminary, something I never learned about, but I've learned a lot about it. And you know, and it's been a grace because I've been able to, you know, to work with, you know, victim survivors, helped establish a healing garden for the Archdiocese a number of years ago over near Holy Family Church on Roosevelt Road. That is meant to be a place, a living space where people can come and pray and reflect. And, you know, there's plaques around the garden that just different scripture quotes, but also apologies from the church, you know, regarding this. But again, as I've learned about this stuff, and as I, you know, continue to counsel people who have been abused, when they, you know, will reveal that to me, you know, there's a wound that people carry. And, you know, in some cases, there's 3 people that I'm working with right now who, you know, probably for 4 or 5 years now, who are still revisited by those horrible memories, you know, and the abuse seems to happen again for them. And it's like, how do you break that cycle and help them to say, you know, I'm not going to let this them continue to abuse me. But I call it the abuse of memory, because we hold these memories and we, you know, and we, something triggers and we are forced to revisit them, and they re-traumatize us, you know. Again, there's a wound that we as white people carry, that it's not the same thing, but it's something that is hidden, something we don't want to acknowledge, yet it's something that, you know, continues to impede our growth, you know, and our, you know, really coming together with others who, you know, look different from us. I mean, that is the challenge in our society. For me, and how's my time? I'm just trying to, I don't have my clock, so 15 minutes, okay. Does that include questions or not? It includes questions, okay, so I'll just go another few minutes then. So a number of years ago, one of my the people, spiritual, you know, people that I love to read is a priest named Ron Rolheiser, Father Ron Rolheiser. And Rolheiser, at one point in one of his writings, talked about the loneliness of God. The loneliness of God, you know, and the loneliness, you know, in the Christian context, the loneliness of Christ. And I thought, and I really had to think about it. What the heck does that mean? How could God be lonely? How could God be lonely? Surrounded by angels, saints, all these, people worshiping and all these sorts of things. And what it came down to me was, going to the Christian scriptures, and Jesus in his final days, his prayer to the Father, that all may be one, that all may be one. It's the heart of this place, that all may be one. And so I took that, and I love to write poetry and prose, so I'm going to read this piece that I wrote just because I wanted to capture that somehow, in some way. And I have copies of this for everyone, if you would like. And it is in a Christian context, but it's called In the Loneliness Longing. That all may be one, the cry of God's heart, the fire of God's longing as our source and our destiny. To answer the cry, to enter the fire, one must recognize one's own unresolved desire for intimacy, longing for power over, instant gratification, desire to acquire and possess, aching with tension, frustration, and restlessness. We seek resolution in abuse of power, greed, pursuing prestige, demeaning others, immersing ourselves in tasks that give us a false sense of worth, accomplishment, and in the end, leave us restless, anxious, wanting more, even more. Yet the Spirit beckons. Let your false love give way to the love of Christ. Your deep frustration be consumed by Advent hopeful waiting. Your restlessness fall away into a joyous gestation of Christ's longing, sublime passion, willing submission, total self-giving, generous outpouring, forgiveness upon forgiveness, relentless hope, that all may be one. So God calls us to enter into, to be transformed by God's loneliness. God lonely, how can this be? Surrounded by angels, a communion of saints, loved ones passed on before us, caught up in the dance with Creator and Spirit. God lonely, daily overwhelmed by adoration, gratitude, and endless refrain of supplicants calling on his name. Yet lonely indeed is the one who longs from a time with no beginning, from a heart with infinite capacity to embrace, from a well of love that runs infinitely deep, that all may be one. Lord God, let me enter into your loneliness that aches for consummation with my sometimes recalcitrant, reluctant spirit that pines for my submission to unwavering hope, unquestioning sacrifice, relentless compassion. Give me the courage and determination to traverse the minefields of self-absorption, self-pity, self-gratification, and self-promotion. Free then to offer my God-given gifts to my brothers and sisters with a deep capacity for empathy, seeking to accompany them anywhere, anytime, to lighten their burdens, to help them develop and share their God-given potential. Let me be Christ for them and be surprised, awed, fed, and humbled as how they are Christ for me. Let me seek you lonely, waiting in the shattered spirit of a battered woman, the confused mind of an abused child, the haunted souls of those ravaged by war, famine, and genocide, and the immigrant fearing deportation and separation from their family, in the decimated dreams of a parent losing a child, a job, a spouse, in the person of color, the woman, the person of homosexual orientation, felt demeaned, ostracized, unwelcome, in those lonely for lack of ability to love and or to accept love, in the loneliness of my own heart, in the person who has lost all hope. And having found you there, let me join my spirit to yours, that together we may uplift and embrace and mutually empower those we've encountered to join us on the journey, the kingdom less lonely, the world less harsh, the future more promising, our collective longing ever nearer, that all loneliness may be assuaged, that all may be one. Amen. So I'm going to open it up for questions or comments or reflections. Be curious, just your own thoughts, observations, insights, wisdom, all those sorts of things. So anything anyone wants to ask or offer, just a reflection from what I've shared, please.
Thanks, Chris. So thank you very much. Beautiful talk. We got to learn a lot of things from you. Beneficial, like for a passers-by like us, maybe. Sure. You spoke about a lot of work that you did. One question I had about Simon of Cyrene that always puzzles me, because it's the church says Saint Cyrene of Simon of Cyrene, but he was not canonized by the church as a saint. But he was a legend, right? The Bible story about Simon is a legend. In the 5th station, he helps Jesus and all. So I was just always wondered what happened to him after that, because I don't know what happened to Simon. Did he went back to Africa back again? Or I know you didn't cover this part, but I was always, because your name, the church name is like that, it's just like...
I'm not hearing everything you're saying, so maybe, why don't you speak without the microphone, just so, because I'm not...
So I was wondering about Simon of Cyrene, or the figure in the Bible. It says that he, 5th station, he helped Jesus, and that is a legendary story. But I do not believe the church canonized sainthood to Simon. But it is a legendary story, and it's an inspirational story. And I always wondered what happened to Simon after that, because I have not heard anything after that. Such a great figure who is there at the last minute, and do you know anything about that?
It's interesting because when we chose that name, I did a lot of research to try to find out more. There is very little written about Simon in the Roman Catholic tradition. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there is a lot of writing about Simon. And so what we know about Simon, obviously he was drafted, to help carry the cross of Jesus. We know since he was from Cyrene, African, okay. We know that his sons are mentioned, Rufus and Alexander, in one of the Gospels. And so we know they had to be part of the early Christian community. And so we suspect Simon was as well, since his sons, were familiar to the author of the scriptures. We don't know a lot about Simon after that, but again, as in many cases, there are legends, about how Simon, went back and was one of the first disciples, to evangelize Africa. Again, it's not a surprise to me that it's not raised up more in the Roman Catholic Church, because it was kind of a European-focused, even though our origins are, in Israel and the Middle East and, all of that. We're still very centered on that. And we resist this, connection, to Africa at times. And yet there is a rich, rich tradition of Christianity in the early African church, especially in northern Africa. One of the myths about and the enslavement of people as well. One of the gifts that they got from us was Christianity. When probably 30-40% of those who were enslaved were probably Christian, before they came over here. Another probably 40% were Muslim, and so they had faith. They had a faith tradition. And there's interesting stories about the early Muslim community in the United States. And I mean, again, there's a sense that maybe Frederick Douglass himself was maybe from a Muslim tradition. Harriet Tubman, because of her dreaming, thing that perhaps she was, because they think she came from a part of Africa where, that whole dream, kind of spirituality is very, very strong. But there's actual stories. There's a book, I can't remember the name of it, but about the first Muslims in America. But anyway, back to Northern Africa. So one of the things that I love, and again, Simon, we kind of lose track of him, but there's a lot of legends written about him, that are interesting to read. There's even one legend, and I love it. It's actually a play that was written by a white man, but for the African American community back in the 40s or 50s, and it's a story about Simon of Cyrene, but as Simon as a zealot, as one who was wanting to fight, to keep, to make Christ the emperor, and so there's this whole play written about that, and I mean, just a fascinating sort of, kind of thinking about, again, there's lots of legends, as is true of a lot of the saints. He is a recognized saint in the Catholic Church, in the Catholic tradition, but again, that thread that leads into Northern Africa, and again, Northern Africa is where the monastic tradition, so the whole sense of monasteries and all of that really started. That a lot of people don't think. Everybody thinks they started in Europe and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is that there was a bishop from Northern Africa who was a good friend of a bishop in France. And the bishop in Africa taught the bishop in France about the monastic tradition, and about the history of the monastic tradition and the spirituality of the monastic tradition. Well, this bishop happened to be one of the mentors for St. Patrick. And so St. Patrick took the African monastic tradition to establish monasteries in Ireland. And a lot of people don't know that, but that's fact. So again, there's a lot of richness that comes out of Africa, and that spirituality, which is strong. For me, I've been touched deeply by Black Catholic spirituality, by Black Christian spirituality, and the more and more I visit Africa, I just feel that. There's something deep there. And there's something for all of us to learn about how do we face fears? How do we have this persistence in faith? To truly believe that God has a destiny for us, and that despite again the whole history over 400 years of enslavement and then Jim Crow and lynching and everything else that has happened since then, the spirituality within the African American community has been so deeply rooted, and it's what's gotten people through. It's that persistence, perseverance, resilience, just deep faith, and there are just lots of different levels to that. And so, being 18 years at St. Agatha, St. Simon of Cyrene, I learned a lot. I mean, it's part of the impulse for my book is I want white people to know we have things to learn from the Black community. We have lots to learn, and we got to get beyond this, like, oh, those poor people, we got to take care of them, and that kind of stuff, and they have nothing to offer us. It's just, it's demeaning, and I fight that all the time, when I talk to bishops and priests and others, because it's like, how do we change that mentality? How do we break that down? So, but Simon has a fascinating history, and you can read more about that in the, if you look at some of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there's a lot more about Simon there. Yeah, so thanks for that question. Others, please.
So I just wonder, how do you teach people to be anti-racist?
How do we teach people to be anti-racist? Okay. So the journey for me is, first of all, there's got to be openness. So it's, thank you. Okay, thank you. So there has to be an openness to it. You know, as I tell people, the first step is showing up. It's just showing up and being willing to engage in conversation, you know, and to have the courage to do so, because the initial impulse is, okay, I'm going to be shamed, or I'm going to, you know, be made to feel guilty, and you know, and I always try to want to make sure. Well, I always want to make sure that people, that's not what this is about. This is about realizing that, you know, certain people are treated poorly, you know, and you know, and we have, as the white community, you know, had every opportunity but at the disadvantage of the black community over the years. And that, again, that's just the history, is, you know, the whole history of slavery, you know, the whole history of, you know, post, you know, emancipation, when there was still slavery happening, but, you know, typically in the form of convict leasing, where you could be arrested on the street for loitering, end up going before a judge, lawyer, witness. They would assign a penalty, a fee that you had to pay. Typically, the person couldn't pay the fee, and so they constricted them, or they leased them out to employers, plantations, factories, mines, where the miners or the plantation owners would pay them their fees, the judges and lawyers, take these people and work them to death. There were probably far more deaths during the convict leasing time than there were during actual slavery, that slavery period, because there was just, people were available, and there was this whole market for people to be arrested and without any reason at all, and end up, you know, working in the mines for life, and working in the factories for life, working in plantations for life. You know, and that ended in the 40s and 50s. You know, during that time, of course, there was a lynching and the threat of lynching, and that hanging over the community, all that. You know, you move into, you know, World War II, you know, post-World War II. You know, the GI Bill was supposed to benefit everyone, but again, the whole segregation, you know, black people could only move into certain areas. You couldn't move into the suburbs. You couldn't become part of the middle class. And so there was that war on drugs, you know, or the introduction of drugs, and, you know, and then the war on drugs. And now we have this whole system of incarceration that is now, you know, part of the whole detention system now for, you know, for the undocumented immigrant community, and sometimes for those who are here legally. But that's a whole industry as well. And in a way, there's a bit of slavery going on in that system, because those who are in those institutions are oftentimes paid $1 an hour to do something that they would get $15 an hour, you know, minimum wage, if they were doing it. And companies, you know, in the United States contract with some of these prisons for their labor. And so again, slave labor continues. So we've got this whole system that's built on the incarceration and on recidivism. Worked with a lot of formerly incarcerated men and women. Actually, I'm working with a friend of mine on a documentary that we're doing on the spiritual lives of formerly incarcerated men. Specifically, we're going to be doing one on women as well. But again, you know, this whole sense of, you know, that in every case, them describing their situation in prison, it's just horrific conditions. There's no real opportunities, unless you really, 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 really fight for it, to get an education, you know, to get, you know, things that are meant to rehabilitate instead. And so the system is really set up so that you actually come out worse, and that you know, and that you recidivize, that you commit something again, so you get back in prison. So it's not meant to rehabilitate people, send them back to the community, become better people in the community. But it's set up to say, okay, we're going to let you out, serve your term, but we'll see you. We'll see you in the future. You know, but again, there's this whole system set up, this prison industrial complex that, you know, there's a friend of mine that produces these T-shirts, and the front says "Crime Pays," and on the back it has judges, lawyers, you know, prison officials, you know, a whole list of people that benefit from it, other than the individual who, who committed a crime. So, it's this whole industry, and it's like it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so again, it's something that's placed, and it's like, how do you break that down? We've got more and more private prisons being built that depend on, an occupancy. They will not get paid unless they have occupants. And so that causes them to pay judges and officers to arrest, to encourage them to get people into the prison. It's just this whole system that's set up that is so convoluted. And again, it's a challenge for us is how do we, first of all, educate people about that, and then how do we together break that down? Because we're up against a lot of money. The only other power we have is the power of people, right? Oh yeah, exactly. It is. It's changing mindset. But in terms of the race conversation, it really is. It's like, how do we name that? First of all, there's got to be an openness to the conversation, right? And in the spirit of not shaming or guilting, but saying we've got to recognize the difference here. And a lot of it comes across in that question. Would you want to be treated the same way as a black person is today? It's very revealing. It's like, okay. And there's a lot of people out there. I live in Oak Park. Oak Park's a wonderful community, integrated community, all this kind of stuff. But there's a report that came out, to the village board a few weeks ago from UIC that they had a study done. And although Oak Park is integrated, and people, say, oh, we're not racist and all of that, they're very clear. There's a sense of welcoming in Oak Park, but not a sense of inclusion. So people are living together, similar economic levels, but they're not really getting to know each other. They're not really having those conversations about, So it's like, how do we engage those people, perhaps first say, okay, you say you get it, but, there's more to learn. There's more to learn. People that posted Black Lives Matter signs and all that kind of stuff, I wanted to go in some of those businesses and say, okay, what have you done for black people lately? I wanted to go knock on some of those doors where people had, Black Lives Matter in front of their homes and say, okay, what have you done for black people lately? And it just becomes, so it's like, okay, we're in solidarity with black people because, all this stuff that happened. But there's not really, any engagement. And so part of my book is like, okay, how do we begin the conversation? How do we get beyond the lizard brain reflex? How do we start learning about the history? How do we name the prejudices that we've been taught over the years? How do we recognize that as a wound that we carry and be willing to come together with our black brothers and sisters and say, we know you carry a wound from racism. This is the wound we carry, and let's talk about that. And let's figure out a way together to heal that wound. So, again, in the Christian tradition, we have, Jesus, life, death, resurrection. And in my book, I like, okay, yeah, as white people, we want to say to black people, we're sorry for what we did, and we want to hear black people say, we forgive you. But then as white people, we want to say, okay, let's just get along, And the reality is, it's not that easy. There's repair that needs to be done. There's conversations that need to happen. So again, in the Christian tradition, we have Good Friday, the death. We have, we have Holy Thursday, which is, again, the Eucharist, the washing of feet, that whole tradition, which is wonderful. But then Good Friday, the cross. But Holy Saturday, we want to jump to Easter. We want to jump to resurrection, but there's something that happens between the cross and resurrection. There's something happening in that tomb. Okay, this isn't just the scene where Jesus is dead. According to our tradition, Jesus is actually active. We say he descended into hell, so he's going to he's taken that into every dark place in the universe and transforming that. So for me, Holy Saturday is about restorative justice. How do we create a space that can seem like a tomb, where we're really talking about hard things, death and hardship and all those sorts of things, but where that tomb can really turn into a womb when we have those conversations, where it can give birth to something new, new possibilities. That's the hard part, is getting people there. Because first we have to come to turn face to face with the cross. Not just the cross of 2,000 years ago, but the cross that continues to be endured today. So actually I wish I had brought a picture with me. But part of my book is, the cover of the book is actually a painting that I commissioned from a black artist friend of mine. And it's an image of Jesus that you literally have to stand in front of and actually look directly into his eyes when he's on the cross. And again, I did a lot of study about, how the whole tradition of crucifixion and the way people were crucified was not, they didn't carry a cross. They carried the cross beam, okay? They carried the horizontal beam. And they were taken to a place on the side of the road, on a hill or whatever, where there was a dead tree. They would nail them to the cross beam. They would hoist that onto the tree, bind it to the tree, and then nail their feet to the tree. So it wasn't like people were up here. It's like they're right here. So when you pass by, you weren't looking like up here the way we portray Jesus, in our churches, but it's like right here. And so, so the image I had painted, is an image where you have to, literally, you stand in front of this, and you have to look into the eyes of Jesus, which the artist did a great job. For me, it was important that the eyes reflect both deep pain and deep love, because both of those emotions can be carried at the same time. So deep pain, deep love, and to come face to face with that. So we actually, go around. I'd love to, I can do that sometime as well. Is to bring, that painting. It's actually 4 foot by 8 foot, so it's a huge painting. But the imagery is really powerful in it in terms of, both having to look in the eyes of Christ, but also there's people gathered around it, and different, elements to that. But again, I make the argument that, in the Christian church, we have sanitized the cross. Jesus is up here, distance away from us, right? Typically the image is like Jesus looking up to the Father, where he's looking down, he's dead, okay? It's rare that you see a cross where Jesus is actually looking, out. And you have to look into his eyes. And for me, that was really important, because we have to come face to face with the cross. And be in touch with that deep pain and deep love that is there to redeem us. So, anyway, that's my...
Father Larry, thank you so much on behalf of everyone and also the Vivekananda Vedanta Society of Chicago. I'd like to thank you for sharing the deep connection between spirituality and faith with humanity, actually. And thanks for sharing how it how spirituality helps to heal the agonies, that the boundaries that we create based on color, based on race, and so forth. And you shared not only the intellectual aspects, but also how to put into action your wonderful work that you did. And we greatly appreciate you for gifting us your presence today and coming here. And on behalf of the Vivekananda Vedanta Society of Chicago and Swami Shatmananda, we'd like to give you a token of appreciation, and may I invite Laura Jones, one of our members, to come and give you the token of appreciation, if you can come.